Tom Graves is well known here in San Francisco as a photographer, as an author, and as a speaker, and as a marvelous citizen. So with that, help me welcome Tom Graves up to the podium.
Thank you, everyone, this mature audience. I'm going to turn this off so you don't have to debate whether to watch it or watch me, but I'll just say before I do it, these are my friends. My wife and I figured out the median age of our friends now is 88 years old. These are veterans of World War II and the Korean War, from the Marine Corps, Army, Air Corps, Navy, and Coast Guard. And they're among the nearly 300 now people I've interviewed. A number of them we're going to talk about tonight, but these are my friends. Actually, a couple are here tonight. So see if you can find them in the audience. I am a writer, I am a photographer, I'm becoming a public speaker, but I'm not at the point where I can do that efficiently without notes. I've been asked to speak until about 7 o'clock tonight, and we don't have to stick with that. I hope we'll have lots of questions, and I bet we will. But what I do is I write my talk down so I stick to the topic and don't go too far afield. So you'll excuse me, but I have to read. Thanks for being here. I think you're going to hear about some American heroes you probably don't know much about. And I'd particularly like to thank General Myatt and the Marines Memorial Club for hosting this special evening. I did not know I had to call on a 3-star to make this evening happen. I didn't think that would happen. Many of you, some of you anyway, have read my book. Some of you have given me some great feedback about it. Some of you have shared it with others. Miss Murphy, who's here, proofread an early draft and gave me some very worthwhile feedback. My colleague, Ron Schreier, is sitting in the back. He and I have worked together for over 30 years, and he did a lot of work on these photographs with me. My wife, Becky, is here, who's a great advocate of my work, but also a great advocate of the veterans who we're going to talk about tonight. And she will be helping me assign and sell books at the end of my talk. Tonight's not really about selling books. It's about me sharing some things that I've learned with you, some things that actually have surprised me. However, we expected about 100 people tonight. We brought 200 books, so you can work that math out on your own. Those of you who may know me, I don't usually wear a suit. I usually just wear a suit at weddings and funerals, and since wine is being served tonight, I'm considering this a wedding. When I'm up at night and channel surfing, and it's often the military channel, but sometimes something else, one movie that I can't pass by is the Clint Eastwood movie, Heartbreak Ridge. And if you haven't seen it, Clint Eastwood plays this old, craggy Marine Corps sergeant who served in Korea, earned the Medal of Honor, and is trying to keep his place in the new Marine Corps. His commander is a young, Annapolis-schooled major, very different set of ideals, and he had just come over from supply to the infantry. And he addresses a general at one point and says, I've never had the honor of leading men in combat. And neither have I. You know, I'm not a veteran. General Myatt was surprised the first time I've told him that. But there are many veterans here. I salute you as I can as a civilian. Those of us who are not veterans recognize that someone has to fight our battles. We're glad that you did it, and we're glad that we didn't do it. I don't think any veteran I've talked to in the last 10 years or more has had anything besides a anti-war sentiment that they shared with me. Sometimes we have to fight, but we try very hard not to. We depend on our government and our diplomats to keep us out of harm's way. Sometimes those efforts fail. But my mission as a writer is twofold, is to honor the veterans who have served and to share their stories with others. And my mission began about 12 years ago due to a friend of mine who you may know, Dennis Cavaniero, who's a Marine veteran of the Vietnam War. He introduced me to one of his group of Marine Corps friends, the Combat Correspondence Association, and I attended some of their luncheons and began to get to know the people there and get to know their stories and get to appreciate them as veterans, but also as people. And I felt it was important to try to share their stories with others. So I began to photograph them and collect their stories, and I didn't know that I would be doing that the next 12 years, and now have nearly 300 of those interviews and portraits. I made an effort in collecting those interviews to find people in other parts of the country, to find men and women, to find admirals, generals, but also ordinary seamen and privates, and people of every ethnic background. But tonight I'm going to talk about a specific set of veterans and my book, Twice Heroes, which is the first book to be published of this information that I've collected. We have about 40 minutes, but that's not enough time for you to really learn about this story, but I think you'll learn enough tonight to make you want to learn more, either from my book or from another book. First, I'd like to share with you, my father was a GI who fought in Europe during World War II. He would never talk with me about his experiences in the service, except for the most innocuous anecdotes, like when the pub closed at night and they had to hurry back to the base, they would steal the bicycles that the civilians left outside the pub, ride them, leave them at the front gate at the base, and of course the next morning the civilians would come and get their bicycles and go back about their business. And this went on every day and night. He was stationed in Northern Ireland while the Allies awaited the invasion of France, and spent a year there during which it rained every day except 3. He's not crazy about Northern Ireland. In the 60s, there was a song on the radio with this sort of wah-wah sound that he said reminded him of the buzz bombs he heard going overhead. And one night on the way home, for some reason, he decided to demonstrate for me how easy it was to drive without headlights, like he did throughout the war. Beyond that, he never talked about the war, and we were only reminded of it by the nightmares he would have when he would wake us up in our small house shouting in the middle of the night. And those nightmares continued until he was almost 80 years old. Although he wouldn't talk to me, I was surprised one day to learn that he had talked to a friend of mine who had called him from the beaches of Normandy on a cell phone, had gone to visit Normandy, had all sorts of questions for my dad. And he talked to my dad for about an hour. I don't know what the cell phone bill was like. I never got that info. But he asked him, Mr. Graves, where did you sleep? He said, I didn't sleep. Where did you guys take showers? We didn't take showers. And it went on like that for about an hour. A few years later, my wife and I scattered my dad's ashes on Utah Beach. And I don't know if that was actually allowed, but it seemed like the thing to do, since he might have ended up there anyway in 1944. And most veterans are like my dad. They don't want to talk about combat. They don't want to talk about the war. And the Japanese Americans, who are in my book, Twice Heroes, are particularly reticent to talk about those things. But these are men and women who fought for the United States while our government was illegally imprisoning their families in harsh internment camps in remote parts of the country. I'm not the only one who finds their story compelling. I want to just mention the words of a couple other people. Oh, I'm out of order. President Clinton said, "Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated." By the end of World War II, America's military leaders in Europe all wanted these men under their command. Their motto was "Go for broke," and they risked it all to win it all. Many of you here may know Navy Chief Johnny Johnson. When I told him about our talk here tonight, he emailed back and he said simply, "These are America's greatest Americans." And I want to tell you why. Here's the stories of just a couple of these heroes. The Nisei, they're called because they're the second generation Japanese Americans. Their parents came from Japan. They were born here. They were American citizens. And they are given the nomenclature of Nisei. One soldier in the book grew up in Southern California, and as a high school student, worked as a delivery boy for a produce distributor. When World War II broke out, he was among the first Nisei trained as Army linguists in the Military Intelligence Service. And he was among the 14 linguists assigned to Burma with Merrill's Marauders. His battalion was pinned down and cut off. One night, he crawled forward of his lines to within a few feet of the enemy and overheard their preparations for an attack the next morning. When the attack came, the Marauders were prepared. They cut down the first wave, and the enemy began to retreat. The linguist stood up in the middle of the battle and yelled in Japanese the order to charge. The second wave of enemy soldiers reversed themselves and charged right into the American guns and to their death. The soldier was written up for a Medal of Honor, but his commander, a colonel from Texas, said he was just an enlisted man doing his job. He's of Jap descent, and a Jap don't deserve a medal. But he earned the Distinguished Service Cross and a Bronze Star and is in both the Ranger Hall of Fame and the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. His name is Roy Matsumoto, and he turned 100 years old on May 1st. One man I interviewed is 92 or 93. He lives here in the Bay Area. And as an Army sergeant in 1944, he had a safe job as a clerk at Camp Robinson, Arkansas. At the same time he was serving, his family was held in one of the 2 internment camps in Arkansas. The Nisei 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team were already in combat in Europe and were taking so many casualties, the Army asked for volunteer replacements. The sergeant volunteered, giving up his stripes when he went overseas because he did not want to lead men in combat. He was only a clerk. He had the flu when he met up with the unit and headed into combat. He marched in the rain, he said, not knowing anyone except the man in front of him and the man behind. His platoon was held up by enemy troops and a tank, and he volunteered to go after the tank with a bazooka. The tank spotted him and his assistant and fired at them with its big gun. He was wounded by the blast and evacuated. He had spent 6 days in the field. He lost 2 ribs and spent a year in different hospitals. When he got out, he went to school but had to quit because he couldn't concentrate. He tried to get a job, but no one would hire him because he was Japanese American. Even though he had a Bronze Star and Purple Heart. He couldn't go home, he said, because he had no home. His family lost their home in the internment. He's writing his memoir because he wants his nieces and nephews to know why he was fighting. Not for the heck of it, he said, but to make it easier for them to have the successes they have enjoyed as Americans. An 18-year-old high school senior from Honolulu volunteered right after Pearl Harbor. He soon proved himself a leader and once overseas earned a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. My wife and I just returned from Italy, where we visited battle sites where the Nisei fought. In the Apennine Mountains north of Pisa, there's a village named Tendola, and 2 kilometers away, a tiny village called San Terenzo, too small even for a bus to reach. What follows is mostly from the lieutenant's medal citation. We'll see how its writing compares to mine. On 21 April 1945, Easy Company, the 442nd, was advancing on San Terenzo, and the lieutenant directed his platoon through a hail of automatic weapon and small arms fire to capture an artillery and mortar post, and brought his men to within 40 yards of the hostile force. The enemy halted their advance with crossfire from 3 machine guns. With complete disregard for his personal safety, he crawled up the treacherous slope to within 5 yards of the nearest machine gun and hurled 2 grenades, destroying the emplacement. Before the enemy could retaliate, he stood up and neutralized a second machine gun nest. Although wounded by a sniper's bullet, he continued to engage other hostile positions at close range until an exploding grenade shattered his right arm. Despite the intense pain, he refused evacuation and continued to direct his platoon until enemy resistance was broken and his men were again deployed in defensive positions. In the attack, 25 enemy soldiers were killed and 8 others captured. By his gallant, aggressive tactics and by his indomitable leadership, the lieutenant enabled his platoon to advance through formidable resistance and was instrumental in the capture of the ridge. That was the medal citation. I can tell you that out of the hospital and on his way back home, he went into a San Francisco barber shop to get his hair cut so he'd look sharp when he got off in Honolulu. He wore his uniform with the Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star, Purple Heart with Cluster, and 12 other medals and citations, and missing his right arm. And he was told, "We don't cut Jap hair." That's the story of the late senator from Hawaii, Daniel K. Inouye, who's on the cover of my book. And 55 years later, his Distinguished Service Cross was upgraded to a Medal of Honor. So these are 3 of the dozens of incredible stories and veterans who appear in my book. They are 3 of the examples I might give when people ask me why I did a book on the Japanese American veterans. Every man and woman I've talked to, among the nearly 300, has their own intriguing story about themselves, about the service to their country, and many of these stories involve episodes of bravery and perseverance in trying conditions. But very few veterans, even other minorities, have the overwhelming and frankly surprising history of a dedicated and sustained fight to prove their competence, loyalty, and citizenship. Like many other minorities, Japanese Americans and other Asian immigrants and their families faced blatant and sometimes, at that time, legal discrimination in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Chinese people had been here for generations, since the California Gold Rush and the building of the railroads. But the Japanese were recent immigrants, most of them arriving in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Most were farmers and fishermen, occupations that their island nation depended upon. Many were well educated, as farming was a noble profession in Japan. But in the US, they were undesirables. They were not allowed to become citizens. They paid higher rates on loans and on insurance policies. They could not join labor unions and could only live in certain neighborhoods. They were not allowed to own real estate. So whatever their success here, they could never own their own homes or farms or businesses, and the immigrant nation could not become citizens. Now their children, the Nisei generation, or what I call the Japanese members of the greatest generation, if you want to think about it, were American citizens because they were born here. They spoke English, not Japanese. They ate hot dogs. They joined the Boy Scouts, played football, baseball. They took their dates to the beach. They went to Cal, the University of Washington, and other fine schools. And when the draft was instituted in 1940, they served like other young American men. They were American in every way, but they could not escape the prejudice heaped on them by their neighbors and their fellow citizens. Discrimination was worst here in California and on the West Coast, where most Japanese Americans lived, and where their skills in farming and fishing were seen as an economic threat by Caucasians. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the reaction of the Nisei was like that of other Americans. First they were stunned, then they were incensed. In San Francisco, they lined up at the Federal Building with hundreds of other young men, but they were not accepted for service. "We don't take Japs," some of them were told. Lawson Sakai said when he heard that, he felt he had lost all his rights as a citizen. Lawson later earned a Bronze Star and 4 Purple Hearts in Europe. Their fellow Americans treated the Nisei as if they were the enemy. They lost their jobs. High school students were discouraged from higher education. Those already in the military were discharged or marginalized into menial assignments like picking up cigarette butts or moving boxes back and forth in a warehouse. Community leaders, teachers, businessmen, Buddhist priests were picked up by the police and FBI and taken away without charges being filed. Sometimes 5 or 6 months would pass before their families would hear from them again. These, of course, were the family breadwinners. The Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco ordered banks to freeze the accounts of Japanese Americans. Things got tough. Remember, the Depression was still going on. On the West Coast, a dark to dawn curfew was ordered. People were not allowed to travel more than a few miles from their homes, and they were ordered to turn in their guns, radios, flashlights, and sometimes even kitchen knives. There was no protest, by the way, by the NRA. In fact, groups such as the American Legion, the Grange, the California Growers, and the Hearst newspapers called for all people of Japanese ancestry to be permanently removed from California and sent back to Japan. Then, as many as you know, in February of 1942, FDR issued an executive order authorizing any area to be declared a significant military zone and for people to be excluded from that zone. The authority to designate those zones was given to Lieutenant General John DeWitt, who was stationed here at the Presidio. General DeWitt decided that zone should include the entire states of California, Oregon, Washington, and parts of Arizona. And the only people to be excluded were the Japanese Americans. This meant the relocation and internment of nearly 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. 10 sprawling camps, concentration camps, as President Truman called them, were constructed in remote parts of the country, such as the Manzanar camp in the California desert. They were built rapidly with millions of board feet of lumber, miles of barbed wire, and labor that was all diverted from the war effort. Their hasty construction meant the buildings were cold in the winter, stifling in the summer, and subject to assault and penetration by the wind-borne sand in desert locations. 10 miles from Cody, Wyoming, the Hart Mountain Prison became the third largest city in the state. People, of course, had to abandon their homes, farms, businesses, and personal property. Leases could not be paid on fishing boats, cars, farm equipment, so it was all lost, and students had to withdraw from schools and colleges. This remains America's largest government attack on its citizens, and the only time the United States has issued an apology for anything, although that took 50 years. The government said at that time the unconstitutional act of the internment was the result of discrimination, wartime hysteria, and poor leadership. So I think I've painted a pretty dark picture so far. But it was from this situation, from these camps, that the Nisei men in large numbers volunteered to fight for America. In March 1943, they got their chance. A regiment was formed, a single segregated Army unit commanded by Caucasian officers. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, including the 100th Infantry Battalion, became the most decorated unit in American military history, with 7 presidential unit citations, half of them in a period of 5 weeks. 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 9,486 Purple Hearts. Their casualty rate was 314%. All this because they fought with an aggressiveness of no other infantry unit, because they fought with a purpose to prove their loyalty to their country. A second significant unit of Japanese Americans that I've only mentioned when I talked about Roy Matsumoto was the Military Intelligence Service. These men and women were trained in the language of the Japanese military, and they served here in the States and with every American, Canadian, and Australian unit in the Pacific Theater. They also served, very importantly, in post-war Japan. By monitoring the enemy's radio transmissions, they directed a squadron of P-38s to intercept and shoot down a plane carrying Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. The MIS interrogated prisoners, negotiated surrenders of prisoners, intercepted communications, and translated documents found on the battlefield. They served in the investigation and prosecution of war criminals. They were called MacArthur's secret weapon. MacArthur said no commander had ever known more about the enemy before a battle than he did with the help of the MIS. 3 Nisei linguists were on the deck of the USS Missouri during the Japanese surrender ceremony. Many stayed in the service and served in military intelligence roles in the Korean War and Vietnam. And their success convinced the military of the importance of foreign language training. And we now have substantial foreign language programs, such as those at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit so I have time for questions, but the discrimination against Japanese Americans continued after the war, even when this decorated unit returned home from combat. There were beatings, shootings, bombings, and arson as Japanese Americans were discouraged from returning to their former farms and neighborhoods. The record of the Japanese Americans during World War II was in part responsible for the integration of the armed forces in 1947. The veterans decided to establish their own American Legion and VFW posts because they were not allowed into the existing ones. They founded a bank in Honolulu where other banks would not lend to Japanese Americans. They pushed for Hawaii statehood and for Japanese Americans in government and the judiciary. Daniel Inouye, of course, was one of them. Another was George Ariyoshi, America's first minority governor, who also appears in the book. So even as the guns silenced, the Nisei generation fought on to make things better for their families and for those not yet born. They succeeded, and in doing so, made things better for all Asian Americans, for all minorities, for all Americans. As President Truman awarded them their 7th Presidential Unit Citation, he said, "You fought the enemy and you fought prejudice and you've won." And that's why I titled my book Twice Heroes. Thank you very much. Ed asked about the casualty rate I quoted of 314%. General Myatt is probably best qualified to explain the casualty percentage to us civilians. Is that correct, that the regiment was replaced 3 times?
Correct.
Yeah. So you can imagine, I know many people who weren't wounded. Some people were wounded 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And the only reason, and I know the general will, or others will correct me if I misspeak, the only way you take those sort of casualties as an infantry unit is if you are very, very aggressive in combat. How many Nisei served in the war, and how many went to Europe versus the Pacific? I'll do the arithmetic backwards. About 6,000 served in the military intelligence service, mostly men, but also a few women. They were the highly trained linguists, and they served either here in military intelligence roles or in the Pacific Theater. But their language they were trained in was Japanese, of course, and the Japanese military language and Japanese military terms was very different from what you would typically learn in a Japanese language class. In November of 1940, the Army did a quick survey of its troops and found that in the entire United States Army, there were 40 speakers of Japanese. And the Army sort of panicked because it was becoming pretty clear that we were going to go to war with Japan. And you have to have these language skills in order to read maps, read military documents, interrogate prisoners, listen to radio transmissions like the one that they used to bring down Admiral Yamamoto's plane. And the Army immediately instituted a foreign language program, and it began here at the Presidio of San Francisco. It was top secret. It began in a building, it was an old aircraft carrier from World War I. It was called Building 640. And it's now being restored as a historic site. What's weird is their language study began, and the first class of 40 soldiers, 38 Nisei and 2 Caucasians. I think one of the Caucasians flunked out. But their training began, and as soon as General DeWitt decided to exclude Japanese Americans from California, that included the soldiers who were here. So the entire school picked up and moved to Minnesota and was there until the end of World War II. And at the end of World War II, it moved to the Presidio of Monterey, where its successor, the Defense Language Institute, is today. To answer Tom's question, the majority of the soldiers fought in Europe in this 447 2nd Regimental Combat Team. It was an oversized regiment of about 3,500 soldiers, and most of the Nisei fought there, so something like 17,000 or so. The Lost Battalion, and I have not been able to confirm this with West Point. I'm told the Lost Battalion is considered by the Army's historians to be one of the most 10 significant battles in Army history. It happened in 1944 in a mountainous area of France along the German border. There's a lot of small towns there, but if you can find Strasbourg, France, the battle took place just west of there in the Vosges Mountains. The Vosges Mountains is very tough terrain. Like the Rhine River, it is part of the barrier between France and Germany. And it was said that no invading army had ever successfully crossed the Vosges Mountains. The Germans had established a defensive line there to keep the Allied advance from the German homeland. And much of the war in Europe was as follows. The Germans had been there several years. They had established wonderful defensive positions. They had had plenty of time to do that, and they always held the high ground. The Americans were always on the offensive, and they always started from the bottom. So the Vosges was no different. The Germans had been there for a couple of years. The village of Bruyères was along a railroad line that was an important supply line for the Germans. It was also an important way for them to withdraw when it was time to withdraw. The 442nd attacked and took the village of Bruyères, a couple other villages, and with terrible casualties, and were ready to be withdrawn and getting a little break. And they were given an order. There's a battalion of Texas troops that have been cut off and surrounded by the enemy. We haven't been able to break through to them. We want you to do it. So they put their packs back on, pick up their rifles again, and for 4 days and 4 nights fought through these Vosges Mountains, often hand to hand, and successfully rescued about 212 men that were cut off. Along the way, they took substantially more casualties than the men they rescued. The division commander was a man by the name of, he was Lieutenant General Dahlquist. He wanted to thank the 442nd for getting his battalion out of there. So he had the whole battalion appear before him the whole regiment rather, appeared before him in order to thank him. And he got there and he was standing up there with the microphone as I am, 8 guys over here, 11 guys over there, 12 guys over here. He turned to his second in command, Colonel Miller, I believe, said, "Where are the men? I ordered the whole regiment to be here." Colonel Miller said, "This is it. The rest are dead or in the hospital." One rifle company of 200 men had 8 riflemen still standing. Another had 14. So again, this was the sort of tenacity with which these men fought.
The prejudices, that these soldiers face, and the purpose, you said, their purpose was to really prove their loyalty. And maybe have some stories that you could share that talk about those loyalties.
Let me think about if I have an example, Doug. But imagine this. Imagine you were falsely accused of a crime, and your family was so accused, and you were all locked up. You were not only locked up, but there was not going to be a trial. You had no defense. You were put in prison and not told when you'd be let out, when you might be let out. What are your choices? You can fight, you can protest, or you can try to get an attorney and plead your case. And some of the Japanese Americans did all of those things. These guys decided the best thing for them and the best thing that might help their families was for them to volunteer and to, in order to prove their loyalty. They felt, in a very basic level, if we die for our country, what else can we do that would be more significant than that? So nothing comes to mind at the moment, but I heard this sentiment over and over again. Obviously, there are different reasons why people do things. People had different reasons for joining up. Some guys were just young guys. They wanted to fight. They wanted to get back at the enemy. They wanted to get out of camp. Not everybody went into combat with red, white, and blue in their eyes. Initially, the Nisei weren't allowed to be drafted or volunteer. Then they opened it up to an experimental unit that accepted volunteers. And these guys did so well, they dropped they opened it up to everyone and made them once again eligible for the draft. So some guys were drafted and would rather not have been there at all. The one thing I've learned in meeting many people is we're all the same in many ways, and we're all different in many ways. We all share certain, as FDR said, Americanism. It's something that lives beyond us. It's something that's inside us. It's something that's, I don't want to say soul, but it's something, it's part of us. It's indistinguishable from us. When we die, it's still there. We're still an American. Becky and I had the opportunity to visit the 2 U.S. Cemeteries in Italy while we were there, and there are a lot of Americans there in Italian soil, and they're still Americans.
I wonder if, because we all have talked about this, if the Japanese Americans knew how dedicated and important it was to have them recognized.
I have not heard about that specifically. I can tell you a couple things. One is I will pass that along to the children of those soldiers so they know that. Secondly, I know General Merrill's commander, whose name I'll think of in a moment. Ed, the 4-star who was in charge of Burma? Stilwell. General Stilwell was, I have to tell you the whole story. The government, first of all, we hear about these terrible internment camps. It was a big mistake. And the government figured out it was a big mistake almost as soon as they did it. When the war was coming to a close and these tens of thousands of people were going to be coming back to the West Coast, they were concerned what was going to happen. There had already been cases of violence against people coming back. So they brought General Stilwell back from the Pacific to Washington. And they said, we want you to go to California, and we want you to make a public appearance in support of the Japanese Americans. So General Stilwell flew to Orange County, and a Japanese American fighting in Europe had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and a few months later had been killed. And the Distinguished Service Cross had never been presented to his family. So they flew the general to Orange County, made an appearance at the family's farm, and presented the Distinguished Service Cross to the family. And then he went with an Army captain who was his PR person, and made a second appearance at the Santa Ana Bowl to a much larger crowd. The Army captain had a chance to give a little speech, and he said as part of that speech, to give people an idea these were Americans just like the rest of them there. The blood that soaks the sands of a beach is all one color. And American is not the color of your skin, but that you're American. And that was, I think, probably the greatest speech ever given by Ronald Reagan. So there are, I want you to know I'm a happy guy, I'm a fun guy, I'm up here talking with you about all this dark stuff because I think it's important that you know about it. But there's along the way, there have been a lot of wonderful stories. One of the most common questions I get asked is, are all these men bitter about this experience? And the answer is sort of what I said a minute ago. Everybody's different. Some guys are bitter. Some guys are happy-go-lucky. Some guys are philosophical about it. Some people are healing about it. They understand the terror that happened on December 7th, just like we understand and might explain to someone the terror that happened on September 11th. So they understand. Many would like to put it in the past and move on. But there are a lot of different human emotions. There are also a lot of wonderful stories that frankly don't get told enough about people who helped their neighbors, who took care of their farms, who looked after their homes, who took in their pets because they couldn't take their dogs to the internment camps. Becky and I were up in Sonoma County a couple of months ago at an event, and someone came over and said there was not one incident of vandalism against any Japanese American's home or property in Sonoma County. Their neighbors took care of them. They recognized them as neighbors. They hoped they were coming back. That didn't happen everywhere, but it happened a lot. And I have one more question, but before I take your question, I just wanted to say in terms of recognition, the recognition was a long time coming. During the war, World War II, there was a certain reticence to give medals to these men, mostly because they were earning so many medals. They kind of thought, what's going on over there? 560 silver stars, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, on and on and on. So the Army studied the medals and found that a number of the Distinguished Service Crosses and one of the Silver Stars should in fact be upgraded to the Medal of Honor. And 20 were on June 21st, 2000, and that was part of the speech I read that President Clinton gave when he upgraded those medals to the Medal of Honor. Of course, most of those recipients had either died in combat or had passed away in the ensuing 55 years. More recently, Congress voted to award the Nisei soldiers of World War II with the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest civilian award that Congress can give someone. And I and a couple other people in this room went to Washington in November of 2011 and went to the Capitol and watched an incredible ceremony in which this medal was presented to the veterans. There is a single gold medal which is struck by the U.S. Mint, and it lives in the Smithsonian. There have been about 150 issued. The first one was to George Washington in 1776. This, of course, is a replica. Those medals have never left the Smithsonian Institution until now. And the Nisei's medal is on a 7-city tour of the country. It's coming to San Francisco on June 29th, and it will be at the DeYoung Museum for a little over a month. So you get to see this in solid gold in a bulletproof case next to an armed guard.
I'm lucky enough to have a book that he sent to Marine Memorial. I'm going to read it. He's got some more books over there to sell, but I think there's a lot of information in those that we can all profit from. And I want to thank you, Tom.
When a lot of these men left Manzanar, they left with a heavy heart because there was a group called the Black Dragon Society.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. As I said, not every single person signed up to enlist when they could. There was a lot of dissension. There was a lot of confusion. And there was a lot of fear in the Japanese American community. When, I'm going to answer your question, but just imagine this. You're asked to come to a meeting point in Japantown, say in San Francisco. Bring only what you can carry. Maybe that's a couple of suitcases. You have your kids. You've already given away your dog because you can't bring your dog. You're not told where you're going, how long you'll be there, what the conditions will be, what will be expected of you. Some people thought they were going to be driven to the harbor and put on a ship back to Japan. Then they were bused to places like Tanforan, which was at the time a racetrack. And they were put into stalls that recently held racehorses that had been whitewashed to make them a little nicer. But they still smelled like horse urine. You couldn't disguise that. You'd be sharing a space with, your family would be sharing a space with another family. It was dreary. The food was terrible. You'd go to breakfast and wait in line for breakfast. There'd be a long line. By the time you got back to your barracks, it was time to go wait in line for lunch. You did that 3 times a day. The ladies had latrines with no doors on them, you know, no personal compartments. You're there for 5 months. You don't hear very much. You hear you're moving. You get on the buses again. They take you to the train station. They put you on a train with all the blinds drawn and drive you out into the desert. Some people thought they were going to be lined up and shot. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what they were going to find. Then they get off the trains and they find Manzanar, which I tell you is no picnic spot. So you can imagine, Jack, the anger some people had. Many people felt they should protest. People aren't dumb. They knew their civil rights were being violated. I went to my first Eagle Scout Court on Saturday, a very moving event. I learned there are 5 ranks of scouts: tenderfoot, second class, first class, star, life, and eagle. 2% make it to eagle. The second class scouts learn about their civil rights and responsibilities. Second class scouts. So people knew their civil rights were being violated. What are you going to do about it? You're in prison. So those who felt that those joining the army were doing the wrong thing, took exception. There were shouting matches, there were fights. A number of guys told me when we volunteered, they didn't give us a throwing away party. We had to sneak out in the middle of the night. I snuck out with one guy, got on a bus and, went to Fort Douglas or something, So like all of us, we don't agree on everything. And in a pressure cooker kind of situation like that, Tempers are short, conditions are miserable, everybody's at each other's throat. This was just one reason for that to happen.